Welcome everyone to something I have chosen to call an epilogue. I don't have a better term, I'm sorry I don't. If that one deceives you or leads you astray, I hope not. It's kind of like an afterglow from the advancing soil health and plant health and human health. And I'm honored today to have with me two guests that are going to take us through a series of very practical discussions. And we're going to try in our best effort to tie our conversation to the content of the symposium. We had some fantastic speakers who brought us a lot of really deep understanding and wisdom. And what we're going to try to do is take the life experiences in farming with one of the panelists that you met, if you've watched to the end of the symposium, Greg Kratzer. We're with Greg today at his farm. And we're going to go through some of the aspects of his farming operation, how things have changed, what he's done, and in an effort to answer practical questions, which Greg became the object of most of those during the panel at the wrap-up of the session. And with me also visiting today from Lubbock, Texas, is Mark Dodd. Mark, born and brought up here in Hoosier country. And happy to have him with us to help us with questions and with comments. And it's kind of a free-flowing roundtable. Of course, you know, when this airs on YouTube, there's going to be a place for you guys and gals to answer or to ask questions, to which I will try to be faithful to make sure you get answers. And of course, your comments and suggestions are always very welcome. So with that introduction, Greg, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you to review briefly, you know, the nature of the farming operation so that everybody gets a feel for the kinds of things that you face on a day-to-day and periodic basis.
I don't know where to start. I'll just... My great-great-great-grandfather came over here, and we still farm ground that he came over here and settled. But we farm over a 40-mile stretch in 6 different counties, a lot of different soil types. And to move forward from there, when I got out of school, I was raising a few hogs. I had about 60 sows, farrow to finish. And in 1985, I believe, I sold out. Confinement buildings were becoming a bigger and bigger thing and more corporate farming, and I wasn't in favor of that. And so rather than trying to understand it or deal with it, I guess I decided to remove myself from the situation and stick my head in the sand. So at that point in time, we were pretty much a corn and soybean rotation operation. Done that for years and years. My brothers and I farmed together and have since we've been out of school. And we grew the operation and we've been competitive in the areas that we farm and been successful. But in 2010, I guess we started taking a hard look at, I had growing children and they wanted to come home, so we built a fair-sized confinement hog feeding operation. We built 4 big quad buildings, and I built them almost in protest to myself. Again, because I stuck my head in the sand back in the 80s. I wasn't educated and decided I had to become educated. So I started studying more and more about the ground and the effects of manure and the effects of fertilizer, and the more I dug into it, the more I was concerned about what we had done from 1985, even prior to that, but up until 2010. In 2011, we finished completion of the buildings. In 2012, we started hauling manure. We seen increases in production in the manure ground versus the non-manure acres. A good number is probably 15 to 18%. Some cases more, almost never less than 15%. Maybe underestimating the numbers a little bit.
And you were injecting, right?
Yes, at that time we were injecting manure 7 to 8 inches in the ground, trying to control odor. We were trying to be good stewards of the ground, but also trying to be good neighbors to our friends. By 2013, we had a fly infestation that was really bad. Had friends, neighbors that we'd known each other for years and talked pretty honest with each other, and even though they were our responsibility and our pigs, I got to say there was days pulling in the lot was pretty hard. It was pretty smelly. So we tried a lot of different polymers and a lot of different materials that are on the market. They all promise you a lot of things, and I will say almost every one of them done something, but none of them done what they said they would. There was not an answer.
But did you guys, have you gone to the no-till in terms of that environment? Well, you couldn't really with injection, could you?
No, we'd tried no-till back in the 80s and had decided it wasn't sustainable for us. Everything I had learned, it took 2 to 3 to 4 years to actually get the ground functioning properly, and what we were experiencing is by the 4th year, you were creating such an anaerobic and aerobic environment. I know there's a lot of people out there successful with it, and I wish them a lot of luck, but we still can't control the weather, and when you can't, it creates issues that you have to deal with, and as soon as you mechanically deal with them, you might as well be working the ground to start with.
Yeah, so let's take a little bit of a break, a pause, and let's talk to Mark for just a minute about his background. I think we got the feel for the kind of agriculture you've been involved with, and you've begun to point out some of the issues. Mark, tell us a little more about yourself.
Okay, I'm Mark Dodd. I am Agronomy Director of a company called Pacific Grow currently. We make seafood hydrolysate. It's kind of a new and upcoming talk about the biological farming. We fit into that mold quite well. I come from Hope, Indiana, Purdue graduate, come from a farm of about 500 sow farrow to finish, about 300 to 500 cattle finished every year, 1,500 acres of row crop. In 1994, I started a precision agriculture business, independently owned, and grew that business quite well. And later on, my son took it over. And now I'm kind of deep in the biological world. I guess my trigger point was why we need to farm different was 1999, I had organophosphate poisoning while planting corn, where some of the organophosphate that I was filling the boxes with was drifted over into my pocket, and my skin absorbed that poison. Went home, ended up in the hospital in intensive care for 5 days, and gave me a stroke. So my epiphany is we need to start farming differently. Also did some work globally in agronomy, and I really enjoyed that and realized that a lot of other nations are working with closer to nature than what the American farmer is. And anytime you work closer with nature, it's a systems approach. It's not about a product, it's about a system and a different way to think about your operation, and we need to work with that. So currently I'm working with a large dealer network with Pacific Grow, and work with other biological companies to teach these systems, these recommendations, and it's always proven to be very successful into everybody's operations.
Very good. All right, so let's swing back One of the hot buttons for, of course, most CAFO operations that are involved with any kind of livestock or swine is how do you get rid of the afterflow? And that's kind of where I interrupted you, Greg, trying to keep good relationships and also improve the ecosystem around your barns for the animals you're trying to bring to market. So give us an update on what's happened there over the, 3 years now or so, going on 4? I think, when you got the first barn treated that you worked with?
Actually, I think we're going on 5th.
Are we really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it's 4. Anyway, to answer your question, I actually I had tried to figure out what I felt was the best approach to injecting the manure to cover it up as rapidly as we could, and I built I had a custom bar built on 20-inch centers, and we were injecting 5,500 to 7,000 gallon of waste to the acre, 7 to 8 inches deep, and in sensitive areas we would be 8 to 9 inches deep, and we done that for a period of time and felt like we were doing the best job that we could. But we noticed as we was pulling up the hills and one thing and another that when you'd make the next pass, you would see it coming up on the surface and actually wanting to run back down the hill in the trench that we'd created. It almost created little washes in the ground. So where we really wanted the nutrients the most on the higher ground, we wasn't holding it. And if you remember one of the first times you were here, I had wheat in the field across the lane out here, and I took a skid steer and dug a hole, and you were going to try to show some guys some root development, and I threw you a real curveball because we had roots really deep in the ground. We had denitrification that year, terrible if you remember. We was trying to find out why, and the roots on that wheat were 2 feet in the ground or deeper. And when you got to asking questions and trying to figure it out, and I told you I'd inline ripped it, and I came to the conclusion they were 20 inches apart. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
And it was.
I said, you running a ripper with 20-inch spacings? Really?
It ended up being the manure bar had created a little hairline fracture in the ground, and what we had done is we'd built a French type drain every 20 inches. So the manure I thought I was putting in the ground that was probably absorbed into the ground just like you would think a leach field would do, rather than moving sideways because of all the rain we had, it went the path of least resistance, and it was just like flushing a toilet. It all run to those knives and took those nutrients straight down, and the roots responded. They went straight down with it. They didn't grow out, they went down. Which was a little bit of an eye-opening experience too. So we met a young man from Illinois. I guess it's okay to say his name.
Well, maybe before we get into that, a couple of slides that we didn't get to look at during the symposium we're going to use now, and I want to bring them up so that there's a little bit of background here for what you're going to talk about with Bo. One of the farms north of Wabash that I've worked with in the past actually had been surface applying, which is, I know where this conversation is going to go now. And they'd been doing it for 13 years, okay? And I was asked to come in, and the corn was probably 8 or 10 inches tall, following the first time they had actually applied manure in a strip. They had always broadcasted it, surface applied, and used tillage that would have been characterized one day as vertical tillage. Real vertical tillage, where nothing really moves. The ground is just fractured, okay? And the distribution of nitrogen that we saw was amazing. In fact, on the slide that will be displayed during our conversation, 68% of the total nitrate nitrogen was resident in the top 7 inches. And it went down a nice little stair step to 21 in the next 7 inches, and then 11% in the next 7 down to 21 inches. And of the total nitrogen, 56% was in the top 7, and then 26, and then 19. This was after 13 years. This sample was taken between corn rows where no nitrogen had been applied for almost 3 years. You with me? Okay, and the amount of nitrogen found in that top 21 inches was 164 pounds, nothing having been applied. Now, I was asked to find out why this corn didn't look normal, so I went and sampled in the corn row itself. And in the slide, that's called strip applied, 3,000 gallons per acre, and it was put in at 3 inches compared to your 7 or 8, okay? Well, in that zone, the top 7 inches, now the total nitrogen was 39%. And the next 7 was 30, and in the bottom was 31. Getting the idea? The nitrate was 45, then down to 26, and then 29. So the big number was at the top and at the bottom, where we had strip applied just 3 inches under the surface just 7, 8 months before. And that's where this flush toilet thing idea struck me that we talked about.
Yeah, so it moved from the top 7 to the bottom 7. It didn't even really pause in the middle 7.
Right.
It just moved to,
And
it just pushed everything down.
Right, and if you could see the slide, there was actually a loss of total nitrogen contained. Instead of finding 314 pounds, which we should have found, adding the manure applied plus what was already there,
Yep.
we should have had 314. Instead, we wound up with 227. So that meant that there was almost 45% of the N that had been applied, or the equivalent thereof, that had moved beyond 21 inches of soil. Scary, right? It would have been really scary if the root systems that I
So can I
found in
ask a
that
question?
field were not deeper than that, yeah.
Did it all go down, or did some of it go up because of the way it converted?
I don't think it did.
Okay, I was just asking.
It wasn't a particularly problematic spring, so there wasn't a lot of, inordinate amount of rainfall. But I will admit this, because of the fact that the soil between the strips remained undisturbed now, the water, which was in the normal rainfall and snowmelt, had to go sideways because it didn't want to go down between where the strips were.
It went to the path of least
It
resistance.
went path of least resistance into the strip, which of course, technically you could say, well, if you got 10 inches of rainfall, you really put 30 inches of rainfall in the strip.
When was these tests taken?
1st of June, end of May. It says May 25th.
And corn's already planted on it.
Oh, yeah, corn is 8, 10, 12.
Well, this middle part tells me that that's where the nitrogen's coming out and into that plant.
Well, that's a possibility, although the reason I was called is because the corn didn't have the usual normal color to it. It looked like it was lacking in. It looked like it was behind where it should have been for the planting date.
And not to disprove your theory, but in traditional tillage, I don't know what their tillage practice is, they'll have trouble having roots very much into that second layer at that level.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
In their
Most
case,
of their roots will be in the top 6 inches at that time.
yeah. Now the penetrometer readings, which I took simultaneously to sampling for the nitrogen, said there was no root system resistance to 30 inches.
Okay.
But when that corn got the V8, V9, it had to have a hard, deep green color.
Oh yes, it
It looked like it was lacking nitrogen
it
because
came on and yielded very well, over 200.
because it had to mineralize. And then once it mineralized, it started taking it in.
Part of what I'm looking at happening here, which I've seen because I do a lot of this type of nitrogen testing, Mark, because I kind of want a motion picture. In other words, what it does is gives me an idea of how much N is moving, and you don't see the whole thing like it was a continuous video or anything, but you get snapshots, kind of like creating a cartoon character, you know, when it was just drawings and you just
and
kept flipping the page,
Yeah.
right? So I think what we see here is actually some flushing that takes place where you'll wind up with zones of concentration and then it moves to the next zone under the influence of water. Okay? For example, if I do this on a no-till situation, believe it or not, it will look exactly like it does conventional. Conventional
Because the
tillage,
planter created the split.
I'm not exactly sure.
I'm asking.
I think that it has more to do with water movement and denitrification than perhaps anything else. Because we know that in no-till,
Well, in no-till, it should be more even, though, shouldn't it?
well, that's what you're supposed to be thinking and that's what you're expecting, but it's not what I find. I find that between the denitrification, between the root system access, it winds up looking like conventional, with concentrations somewhat at the top and somewhat at the bottom, and the lower segment will be in the middle.
Well, then maybe I misunderstood something you said earlier. When you were down north of Wabash, between the rows where you hadn't disturbed the ground,
Yes.
you still had 58 or 9% in the top 7 inches?
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm saying is in no-till, you may have the same stratification, but it should be uniformly distributed. When he ripped that ground 3 or 4 inches deep, he created the toilet effect that we talk about, that the nutrients flush down that.
Yeah.
But in no-till, the stratification of 3 layers, I believe, but it should be more uniform. Is that correct?
All over the field you're talking
Yes.
uniform. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
Yeah, because
I'll go with that.
the water is going to sit on that density layer
Yes.
of silt, you know, and produce. This is why I think denitrification is a problem there, is because you have these prolonged anaerobic conditions which set you up to denitrify.
Yes.
Mark, you were going to say something.
Yes, I agree with you.
Okay.
You know, nitrogen follows water,
Well, yes, certainly in the nitrate form.
right?
Now,
And yet water breaks nitrogen
Right.
down and makes it more movable.
Right, now, so, you know, Greg, I was really curious because we're only down the road here with your surface application technique about 3 years or so.
About 3 years.
Yeah, and so I went right across the road over here on spars and did this same test to see what is happening. I know what it looks like at 13 years, all right?
Right.
I want to see if I can, if there's any change after 3. Is this starting to show up? And lo and behold, it is. At 3 years, it's starting to show up. And now on this field over here across the road, we have 36% of the total N that's in the top 7 inches. And the nitrate N, which is the one that's most apt to be leaving, which could be the real hot button here, right? It's 46%. So we're actually holding nitrate nitrogen in the top 7 inches very well. We're already at 46%. And we started, and I couldn't find that test, it was in the low 30s. And the middle was 30, and the bottom was 30. I mean, it was just like all the way down. When you said uniform, Greg, I wondered if that's what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's already starting to retain the nitrate N. Now this was, like I said, I took this test like 2 weeks ago. What was it? It was mid-December when I did the test. And so that's kind of encouraging. The thing that's very interesting about this test, and I see this trend in other cases, but the ammonium nitrogen, which doesn't move, it's attached to the clay like, you know, a magnet to steel, it's 37% in the bottom 7, which I find very intriguing. But in light of where your root systems are growing, and the root exudates and the decomposition of those root systems, now it's not really that much of a surprise. It doesn't leach. So that means that somehow we're actually leaving nitrogen in the ammonium form in that soil. We're actually creating a nitrogen resource deep in the profile, in the ammonium form. Isn't that interesting, Mark? Because corn loves late season ammonium nitrogen.
Right.
And if we put the root systems down there, we have actually created an ammonium nitrogen resource
Late season.
late season. I mean, to me, this has just been kind of a mind blower. But I think this is part of what, Dr. White was trying to talk to us about, in that root systems have this incredible capability of assessing their own needs and satisfying them. So why wouldn't it be possible that the plant would actually accumulate ammonium nitrogen resources for itself in the future? Corn doesn't know beans are coming next. Beans don't know corn's coming next. But all plants basically have the same basic protocol. We need the right kind of N to fruit. And we need the right kind of N to grow, right? To establish structure. And that means we need nitrate, and that root system is shallow. Well, lo and behold, here we are 3 years down the road, developing 46% of our nitrate nitrogen resource shallow, right where we have this massive early root system development. I just see so much harmony in this. It's just
So I got to ask a question. Are you basically telling me that you feel like the secretions of the plants in one thing and another are changing the conversion from nitrate to ammonium to where it's banking this nitrogen?
yeah. Yep, I do. That's what I see happening here.
I mean, that's the way I understood what you said.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I think if you look at the data and you look at the plant requirements for nutrition, it seems to me like these things are lining up. This is corroborating, let's put it that way, it's corroborating evidence of what scientists have been telling us and physiologists have been telling us about plant requirements for N.
Don't you think that the available oxygen that goes down there to that fungal network, that is the key to making this drive?
Yeah, I think so too. I think that, in fact, I just was watching a Kemp conversation the other day with some guys and said basically, I can't seem to move my soil organic matter reading on my soil test. Whether it's lost by ignition or however you test it, it just doesn't seem to move, and I seem to be doing all the right things. Putting the cover crops out, having green forever and all these root systems to decompose. Why can't I raise this reading? And I think, Mark, it ties into the presence of oxygen during the decomposing process.
Well, we always hear that the microbiome's alive, the soil's alive, it's got astronomical amount of microbes in there, and it's a living community. Anything that lives has got to have oxygen, and water.
Yeah.
And, we're creating this environment, and we've got so many bad habits in agriculture, and here we are is trying to reconnect the signaling mechanism that goes on with our soil microbiome, and that's very important, and oxygen is a key driver in that.
Right. Greg, let's get back to you talking about now how you have evolved in terms of dealing with manure. What exactly is it you're doing, and what have you seen? I've talked about it from the data perspective, collection on your soil.
Okay, I think you were right. I got thinking about it. I think it's 2018 we actually started using young man named Bo Pope Joy come and see me, New Solutions Ag out of Illinois, and had I'd heard them all, but I listened to him, and he was seemed to be a very sincere, very knowledgeable young man, and I done some bucket testing, and was shocked at the results pretty short order. So we went ahead and treated 2 of the barns and left 2 untreated for our sake and his. We were learning. Within 3 months, we treated the other 2 barns. We had such a conversion in our buildings from air quality to flies disappearing. They didn't have a place to nest anymore. And over time, like everything else, DDGs are cheaper than other energy sources, so we're feeding more and more DDGs, which causes a lot of foam. Our foaming issues went away, and even though we had had hogs in these buildings from late 2011 till 2018, we already had 10 to 12 inches in the solids in the bottoms of these pits. We were having trouble moving. When we went to haul manure, immediately we noticed a big difference in that. We noticed a big difference in odor right away, and within a short period of time, we noticed the flies went away. Actually, the best testament I can give you to that is the following year, one of your friends actually came up and seen us and commented on it. We had a big church picnic back here at the pond, and the pond sits right in front of 2 barns that have over 4,000 pigs in them, and everybody wanted to know when I got rid of the pigs. And we told them we hadn't. There's still 8,000 hogs up there, and they didn't even know they were there.
I remember the story you told me about the guy that mows the grass over here at the nutrient fertilizer plant.
Yep.
Saw you in Warren or something during the summer and told him he was sorry to hear that you'd had to depopulate or whatever.
He assumed I'd had to depopulate.
Yeah,
he hadn't
right.
heard it. He just assumed I had.
He'd been used to smelling you a half a mile away, right?
Yeah, yeah, and just thought something had changed. Well, something did change. What I wasn't fully prepared for was the overall effect of the product and what it does in fixing nitrogen. What we found out is maybe that's not the right word, but we were venting off a lot of ammonia, I should say, and hydrogen sulfide and methane, and we noticed the reduction of smell. Methane you can't smell, but the hydrogen sulfide and the ammonia you can smell and burns your eyes. And
you can tear up over those.
Yeah. So my sons and daughter-in-laws and grandsons work in these buildings, and you hear the horror stories about people falling in pits and methane bubbles bursting and people falling down in barns. So I surmised that something really bizarre was going on. So I called Bo and we had a conversation. He bought a Drago air testing quality machine that you actually helped us even perform some of the tests. And I wouldn't advise anybody to do this, probably ever, but we did under controlled circumstances and paying attention and more people involved than one. We were pumping manure out of the pit, and we went in and actually took air quality readings in the building, and the only place we could find any identifiable hydrogen sulfide or ammonia was within 3 or 4 feet of the pump, if I remember right. Is that your recollection?
Yeah.
And they were very, very minimal, and that's at the point of agitation. In the past, when we started pumping manure, you didn't want to be downwind of us. And all of a sudden, that had went away. Our pumping capacity went up considerable, and when we got to the bottom of the pit, it just kept coming. And to back up just a little, what we had noticed, the reason I treated the other 2 barns is we'd put it in the spring, and by midsummer, I took a 3/4 inch piece of PVC plastic and went around and the crust and the foam were going off the top of the pits. In some cases we had a crust, in some cases we had foam. But I took this PVC and I went to find out how many solids were in the bottom of the pit, and in the past you had to wiggle it around quite a bit to work down through them to get to the pit. And I put it in there and I just dropped it like I always did, and it bounced off the cement floor. So it had already dissolved those solids, but when we got that Drago meter, it really put me to thinking that we're not making nitrogen. There's only so much nitrogen being produced by the animal through the feed.
I remember when the tests started coming back that you were drawing them every month, as I recall.
Yeah, we were at that time.
And the numbers just kept going up, and they were like, how are we creating nitrogen?
And we weren't.
You can't create more nitrogen.
No, we were only saving what we had been venting off. That was what you were smelling.
Yeah.
And I guess the best way to tell you is we were venting off almost half of the nitrogen that we were producing, and now we're not. And I can not only show you, I would have to be a little selective because we are biosecurity controlled, but I would almost challenge anybody to come find ammonia coming out of my buildings or hydrogen sulfide. And when I presented this,
Or methane.
what's that?
Or methane.
Or methane, yeah, but the methane is something nobody sees or smells or hears.
Right.
You know, it's the big problem, but
It's the elephant in the tent.
it's the boom.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the big boom.
Yeah, you don't know it's there until the boom goes off.
Yeah. Right.
What kind of animal performance observations?
Our death loss went down, our rate of gain went up. It's no different than we are. Anytime that you have a better respiratory system and feel better, the better you respond to it, and the better they responded to it. I know my one daughter-in-law is a little sensitive in her sinus area, and she's always had to wear a mask in the buildings because of dust and odor. I mean, mostly I think it's hydrogen sulfide pneumonia. She doesn't anymore, and she's the one that told me it's so nice not to have to wear a mask in there. It's not funny. Now, to tell you can come out here and not smell a pig, that would be a falsehood, because there's 8,000 live animals on both sites, and you do have a little hog dander, and you do have a little, a little feed, and there's even a little excretion of some kind on top of the slats they haven't worked through yet. But it's more like going to a county fair. It's not like being around a confined animal. The great thing about it is when we move it, all of a sudden we realized, because we injected it the first year, because that's what we had and what we'd done. But after you'd been here and we dug that pit and you and I both kicked around the toilet system, that we were flushing these nutrients down and they were below root capability of retrieving.
And running downhill.
Yeah, that we were going to try to resolve this. So we built a custom bar and surface applied, and I was really worried. I had 2 knife bars setting up in the lot, ready to hook back up, because I'm thinking I'm going to get phone calls. I'm thinking this is really going to be bad. And normally my neighbors that wave at me most of the time when we're hauling manure don't. And that year I had 2 of them stop and tell me they didn't know what we'd changed, but keep doing it. Literally the only time you could smell it's when we were aerating it, when we were moving it. You could smell it. An open top tanker going down the road, you'll smell it. But you can apply 60, 70 acres a day, and in the past when I was injecting it 2 or 3 weeks later on a damp, cool night, you'd smell it. It didn't smell like raw manure, but you'd smell it. It smelled pungent. And now within 5 minutes of shutting everything down and leaving, you don't even know we're there. You just think somebody had disc a field or worked a field. But we are shallow incorporating with a Kohler system right now. It's on 6.5-inch centers. And we have hoods behind those, and then we run a Phillips type harrow behind it, so we're moving just a little dirt to tie up the spray itself. We're catching it in the dirt coming off the Kohlers. We're actually spraying it right into the dirt off the back of the Kohlers. And it's actually astounding to me how much we've changed the odor. But my nitrogen levels have went up to the mid and upper 60s. The first year I'd done it, I think because of the solids in the bottom of the pit probably controlled more nitrogen than we all would like to think. Some of them got up into the mid 60s. But since we've got those solids out of the bottom, I just seem to hover in those 50 ranges. And
Talking about pounds of N per 1,000 gallons.
yeah, total 2 kN per 1,000. It's also a little funny, the forms they're in. They're much more stable.
Yeah, it's almost all ammonium nitrogen.
Yes.
And virtually no nitrate.
And in the process, because of things we were learning, we ran some more extensive tests, and we're creating a lot of acetic acid. Yes. Which is very, as I learned from gentlemen like you, is very important in hair root production and the plant to be able to respond better to its environment, to uptake water and to intake things that it needs. So it's a piece of the puzzle I never want to do without. I'll go back to what I said when we were down at Wabash. This is not a one thing fixes it. This is, as Mark alluded a little bit ago, it's basically a change in philosophy, and rather than us trying to force the dirt to do something we want it to do, the dirt is far more capable than we ever thought it was if we'll just work with it. And in the process, we follow that application manure with a curse buster, as you know, and we've tried to figure out how to make it functional in one pass, but because of the horsepower requirements and one thing and another, we wear multiple hats around here all the time. So our first priority is we got to get the manure out, and our average production went from about 35 to 38 acres a day to close to 70 acres a day, the way this material flows. And we have less volume to move. If you ever look at a manure report, which we all have, and you see a number of 8 or 9% solids, for the people that don't know it, I will say, they take those solids and they bake them in an oven completely dry. So when they get wet, they swell and they're heavier. We actually gained probably over 2 foot of head space in a year.
I think, yeah, and it's because you're actually reducing the dry material by digestion, which gives you a liquid, which is where this acetic acid is actually coming from.
Yes.
So the density of your material, it actually is going up. The weight per gallon has actually increased.
Yes.
And the volumetric reduction results.
Yes, and the volume we put on goes down because the manure has a higher value. So we are burning less fuel. We are wearing out less tires. We are moving less volume to achieve the same goal, and being, I believe, much better stewards to the ground and much better stewards to our neighbors.
Yeah, instead of doing the 6,000 to 7,000 gallons, you're now putting on how much?
We actually regulate based on farm to farm, but anywhere from, depending on the crop falling, anywhere from 3,500 to about 5,500 gallon. We've reduced everything by a third or more.
Okay, Mark.
Could carbon emissions kind of follow that talk as well? I mean, you're reducing all this gas, you're improving the pig performance. Would you say, and I'm just kind of talking freely here, would you say, because carbon's kind of a hot button issue here in agriculture,
Well, in fact,
that we reduce carbon emissions off that building?
Very typically, these barns were running 10 to 11, maybe 12 parts carbon CN ratio, a little high on the carbon, goal being somewhere around 10 to 1. And right now, the last report I saw, Greg, you can maybe tell me, I thought I saw one that was 8 or 7 to 1.
I think so.
And it's because, of course, we haven't lost the carbon because the methane production has not gone down, but we've retrieved, relative to that, a whole lot more nitrogen. When you move from 45 to 60, that's 30%. And so the ammonia release actually was trumping the methane release, and hence that we have the improved CN ratio to now less than 10 to 1. So in effect, and this is what I like to see, in effect, when we put manure out there now, we don't have a nitrogen requirement to continue decomposing the manure. We've already decomposed it to the point where we have less than a 10 to 1 ratio. So instead of requiring N resources to bring this manure down to a 10 to 1 CN ratio, we've gone beyond that. We now actually have a meaningful nitrogen resource that's free. It's not obligated to decompose. It's now free to actually contribute to microbial protein, which now, with Dr. White's help, helps us to realize that this is actually going to improve the nitrogen status of the plant in a very healthy way. We don't have to spoon feed it nitrate nitrogen. I've seen Greg, I got to say it, I've just seen your plants. So healthy. They aren't the dark green stuff that the
No, I had to
neighbors
get reschooled on that.
Yeah, it's so, but what we have is a plant that stays really healthy because we're relying on the soil rhizophagy phenomenon to actually provide that nitrogen in the form the plant requires it early in life. It's kind of, you know me, I'm really a colostrum nut. I believe that mother's first milk is the most important event in the
Well, and that's why we put the products where we put them. We're placing our products in furry right underneath the seed. So as soon as it sprouts, it's there. But
and it's not NPK.
no, it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
But what you and I have experienced is and we farm acres where we can't get manure, and we still use commercial fertilizers, and we've reduced the rate of them on those acres. We probably should reduce them more. We're still gathering information to make that decision. What I find a little intriguing is where the manure's at. Is we ran a test this last year. Actually, Gus that spoke ran it for us, and I'm not sure I fully understand it yet.
You know, the Biome Makers presentation.
Yeah,
Yes,
yes.
I'm. For people who haven't seen the symposium video, you need to make sure you spend some time with Gus at the symposium.
Anybody that hadn't seen one of these reports needs to talk to Gus, because once you see it, you got to understand it. But we have acres where we've been putting manure. On one farm in particular, we went corn back to corn, and it's had an application both years. And we tested it against a farm that's been farmed virtually the same, other than it hadn't had any manure on it. And the pathogenic biology is actually down on the manure acres rather than up. So again, this isn't one cog. This is you have to get the water and air exchange in the dirt right, probably first and last. Then you have to the colostrum you were talking about. Okay, you have to put a product there that when either on the seed or under the seed, and we do both. So as soon as it germinates, it's in as healthy a state as it can absolutely be in. It's starting out in a really healthy environment. We've got a water-air exchange, which Mark spoke to a little bit ago. Every living thing needs water, air, and food. So we got him in a healthy environment. Then we give him the very best of the very best to start. And since we've been running this program, and with the manure product that we're using, and the effects of it, it seems to be a platform that all this builds on. We know microbes replicate faster inside that product, and beneficial microbes replicate faster inside that product. And at the end of the day, we end up with a plant that I've used 0 fungicides or pesticides. I believe, again, I had to get educated on this a little bit, but the insect world sees things in a spectrum we don't grasp as a whole. I mean, there's a lot of data out there now that maybe a handful of people grasp. And when they fly in and they see a healthy plant, they don't want any part of it. They're looking for one that's already sick because he's easier to prey on. And sometimes we think these really, really dark, almost black leaves are the right thing, and they're not, because the insect sees that, boy, there's a lot of sugar down there for me to eat, or there's a lot of something down there I want to eat.
Very little sugar, actually.
Very little sugar. Okay, the opposite. I misspoke, but anyway, they see it as an easy prey, and therefore, I almost hesitate to say this, but I think I'm going to, and you can decide what you want to do with it. To the point, my insects are flying in my neighbor's fields.
Seen that happen. Seen that happen.
They just don't stop here.
I still need to get the follow-up story now, which dates back several years, about whether or not that field still represents a Western rootworm larval feeding problem or not.
Yeah.
You know, did they ever come back?
So did the packer who takes the pigs from you, did he show any kind of a performance on the carcass quality or lung scores or any kind of those observations?
I think you can talk about that.
Well, it's because of a confidentiality clause I have between them and me. I will speak to the fact that they seen benefits.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
So I think when we talk about this whole soil food web, this is a great example. From the soil, the microbes, feeding the microbes, the air exchange, the carbon,
Feeding the livestock,
feeding the livestock,
feeding us.
feeding us. It's a whole system approach.
It is.
Which is exactly why I called this symposium what I did, Advancing Health for Soil, Plants, and People, right? Because we are all connected, right?
A lot more than
Yes, we know.
I'm prepared to talk about here.
But I see we in agriculture, and we're all guilty of it. We've used some really bad habits, and it's a very unique time in agriculture too, where there is biological methods to alleviate a lot of these problems that we see, and we have to reconnect and reset this microbiome.
One of the things that intrigued me, you and we were talking about this before we started filming, was how you can actually visually see, by inspecting a root system, how well the nutritional cycle or rhizophagy is actually working. Because as you recall in the presentation, Dr. White pointed out that good rhizophagy results in more and longer root hair development. And it also results in better geotrophism. In other words, root systems behave the way they're supposed to under the influence of good nutrition. They go down instead of laterally crossways in your soil. Of course, we know there's physical barriers that can determine too where a root can grow. But one of the things that we looked at on my computer, which we're going to put up now in our discussion, is an organically grown, no record of glyphosate or glufosinate chemistry applied to the soil for at least several decades, compared to one that has exactly the same start in life, the same structural development in terms of results from tillage, the same kinds of influences at germination like you were referring to, Greg. But when you look for these fine root hairs, they're very few. They're there, and the geotrophism is there. The root systems are growing down wonderfully. They've got great depth to them. But when you look at that plant with 30 years of glyphosate, or a combination with glyphosate or glufosinate, we have a very different hair root system structure, which now basically is telling us that we're not being able to extract the contents from the microbes that the root system is attracting. The root system's still going to attract, right? I mean, Dr. White talked about how the plant literally creates an environment around its root hair that draws in the specific bacteria or fungi or combination, right, to satisfy the exact need that that plant has at that point. Whether it's abscisic acid, right, to form an abscission layer and come to maturity and start to dry down, or whether it's silicic acid, which I asked Gus about, remember? Plants have headaches. Is this the same silicic acid as in aspirin? He said, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so when plants are under stress, you'll find in our assay, or our evaluation, the production of more salicylic acid, right? So anyways, if you have this plant which is not exhibiting this rhizophagy trait, you can know that's what it is because the structure is not there that would have been prompted to be created if it was working well. okay? It's yeah, it's like a boxing match, right? The guy who trains longer and harder and can go longer distances usually is going to be the winner, just because he's better trained. So the other thing that we talked about, which I want to bring up, is this whole idea of why rhizophagy works, and the fact that it's the oxygen that you've referred to, you both referred to a couple of times, how important it is that we have air exchange. The gases in that soil have to change. We know the microbes are producing CO2. That's why we do the Solvita test, right? To find out how many microbes we have. So when we wet it, it gases off CO2, and we can say, oh, we have all kinds of microbes here because our Solvita test produced so much CO2. Thank goodness it does, because the plant needs more CO2. It's not looking for less. We won't get into that subject. But then if you hinder the process of getting the contents out of the microbe, out of the bacteria, the rhizophagy really doesn't take place. We've got everything else happening. The microbes are growing. Everything is working just fine. The signaling is going on between the plant and the microbial world, growing the right ones, eating them up. But what was the key building block? Superoxide. And the superoxide was absolutely required in order to dissolve the cell wall to get to the contents. Kind of like a Holstein cow or a beef animal. If you don't have teeth, all right, to machine the lignin, it's better known as cut chewing, the microbes in the rumen cannot extract the value from the fiber in the plant that she's eating. And so this superoxide, which fortunately this was part of the epilogue for me with Dr. White, the creation of that superoxide requires the production of what's called NADPH. And that's a catalyst for the production of the superoxide. And the plant has got to produce this based on the availability of nitrogen and oxygen. The two largest and most important gases in the air that we breathe and that soil breathes. It's 78% N, right?
Soil's not
And
real.
oxygen, 18 to 21, hopefully closer to 21. These two are the major substances in air that are going to fire up this entire process. Only thing missing is iron, because that's the metal catalyst that makes all of this happen. And as he wrote to me in response to my thesis or hypothesis, he said, of course it needs to go to the lab, it needs to be proven, but it makes absolutely perfect sense that if you've been applying anything to your soil which ties up iron, this process, the progress of this process, this reaction, is going to be hindered. And hence the whole of rhizophagy falls apart.
You're lacking available iron.
Available.
You know, all the soil tests that I've seen, there's a lot of iron. You do a sap test, and iron drops out.
And a sap test really is telling us what? That rhizophagy is not working.
Right. So don't go to the market and buy some kind of chelated iron. Don't rush out there too fast. It's usually, you know, I do a lot of sap testing, do some genomics testing too. And, you know, the problem usually is aluminum and chloride. Where's aluminum and chloride? Well, a lot of these soils are high naturally in aluminum, but where I'm working at in Texas, you know, they don't get enough water to wash that through the profile. Plus, they have tremendous amount of compaction. But that, you know, you got to have the right biologicals that will inoculate that aluminum and chloride from being available. You don't want it available in that form. So enzymes that'll slow that process down.
And of course, the other slide, which I have yet to get into Adam's possession, shows a study which I did in 2010, where I actually compared the whole plant corn silage mineral assays done at Dairy One in Ithaca, New York. For corn silage, I think it was 700 to 800 samples that were submitted in the year 2000. And then I did the same, I analyzed the data on about the same number of samples for 2010. Of course, 1993 marked the introduction of Roundup Ready corn and the use of glyphosate as weed control post-emerge, as well as in burn downs. And so we started loading up the soil in 93 even more than we had prior to it, when it was only used for primarily grass control, quackgrass in the Northeast, where most of these silage samples would have come from. And then what I observed, which it was startling to me, was the reduction in the standard deviation and the average content of the plant in iron. It was shoulders and head and shoulders above any other mineral reduction or standard deviation reduction. So here we are now, down the road, another 20 years, or approaching that, from the first set of data. Only 10 years later, it was a 51% reduction in the standard deviation for iron, 28% standard deviation reduction for copper, okay? And 10 years later, it was reduced that much. And now we're 10 years more, and we probably used it even more. And now we've added glufosinate to the equation with Liberty. So is this iron, you're telling me you're seeing it low in sap test, Mark?
Yeah, you know, this is what I really like about SAP. Excuse me. So it's like taking a blood test. It kind of tells you what you ate yesterday. And by using SAP, it's actually a management tool. It takes 3 to 7 days to get results, and you can actually go out there. And if you have to apply another microbe or another type of a mineral, you can, and kind of get things squared back up with the plant.
One of the things that Dr. White wrote back to me when I proposed this connection between glyphosate residue or glyphosate or glufosinate applications and the complexing or the tying up of iron and its impact on rhizophagy was, he said, our answer is still the same. The only way we get rid of these crop residues or these chemical residues is microbiology. So you keep rolling it back, it still keeps coming back in my brain to how do we develop an ecosystem of soil that is bacterial, fungal, protists, archaea, all the different thousands of different life forms. How do we make them all be more productive, right, or reproductive?
Well, I think it's like feeding livestock. You know, Greg and I have got a lot in common with me having a swine background. You have to feed your microbes, and if you're wanting livestock to finish out and perform well, same way with the microbes, you have to feed them.
Are there probiotics in swine feed today? I imagine there are.
I can't answer that. I would guess there's certain things you would call probiotics that either go in through the water or through the feed. It's no different than the human race right now, and as I listen to you guys talk, it just, I know I'm a little different than the average, but if you look at the people in this country, there's an epidemic in blood sugar issues and digestive tract issues. And we have the same thing going on in the livestock industry. And as I've listened to you guys and thought about being down there and listened to Dr. White and these other guys talk, is the realization come to me that the dirt is no different than civilization. All these microbes, which you could say are all of these people, require the same things to live: air, water, and food. And there's only so much. And back in '93, we took the big healthy farmers market away from all of them, and they started eating from a grocery store. And then in about 2000, when generics came on the market and it got really cheap, they couldn't shop at the market anymore. They had to go to the convenience store and more prepackaged food. But we're all competing for the same thing. We're competing for space, water, air, food. The microbes are doing the exact same thing, and when you can turn that table around and introduce them to a healthy environment, it's not that we're destroying one to allow the other one to have more room. We're only putting beneficial things in the soil to allow the beneficial microbes that the plants have a symbiotic relationship with, that they're actually utilizing things that the plants absorb from them, and then they send them back out to reload themselves to come back through again. And the non-beneficial microbiology by nature is just suppressed. It doesn't mean it goes away. It serves a purpose.
That was one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of his talk to me when I've seen this increase in plant health. I mean, obviously implies that we have a healthier microbiome in the soil that's nurturing this, making this healthier plant. And he said that some of these beneficial microbes, bacterial forms, right? Like the Lichenoformes, the Megatheriums, the Bacillus subtilis. There's just a whole list of those that we're actually putting right there where that root system emerges out of that seed. They actually change the character of the pathogen. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That just blew me away. It's like getting born again. You know, it's like somebody's going to move into your life and you really don't like to produce toxins anymore. You hear me?
Well,
we're gonna change your modus operandi here from being lethal and toxic.
well, and as we build this better root structure and one thing and another, we're exposing the plant to a much bigger, better market for the food at once, because all these microbes have expanded because they can. Their environment has changed. It's like living in a bubble. You can only live in that bubble, okay? And the only way your world gets bigger is to expand the bubble. So regardless of what you want to think, you don't want to live in the bubble. You want to live outside the bubble. There's a lot of room. Yeah. The problem is for the last 25 or 30 years, we put our root system in a bubble, and not in a good bubble.
And no-till is about 4 inches deep. Yeah.
I made that statement down there, and I'll stand by it. I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody because I feel the same way about conventional tillage. If you continually beat your soil up and change the structure of it and turn it to silt, guess what? It's going to go down and create a plow sole. Wherever you fracture that ground, it's going to create a plow sole. And roots only grow for so long, and when they hit a path of resistance, what do? They turn sideways. They go the path of least resistance.
They run out of time.
And at that point in time, the soil is hotter. When we start reaching 90 and 100 degrees, your roots are shallower, your moisture's not up where it needs to be. So the absolute best thing to do is build a 20-inch deep root system underneath an 8-inch corn plant, instead of having a 20-inch corn plant with an 8-inch root system.
That's too dangerously close to what I see every time I dig in conventionally tilled. If somehow you could plant it behind a moldboard and never do anything else,
Yep.
or plant it behind a chisel plow and not do anything else.
Plow deep.
You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Right? It's the secondary tillage which just destabilizes all the aggregates.
Well, you create 2 or 3
additional layers.
Different layers.
Yeah.
You got a basement, then you put in the main floor. How many more floors you gonna build on top of it?
Yeah.
Did your earthworms come back?
Did what?
Did your earthworms come back? Come back?
That one is they are. It wasn't quite as fast a recovery as I thought it would be, but and I will speak to it from this standpoint. I see a few more night crawlers, not a lot, but the amount of small worms, the holes, are immensely different. Even if you don't see the worms, you can walk out in my field if we get a hard short rain. It's really kind of bizarre. If we get a hard short rain, you can walk out in my field and see air bubbles
Oh, that's good.
forming all over the ground.
You know, I've got some customers, I brought their earthworms back, and some of the older customers says, I haven't seen this since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I said, well, that's kind of the barometer of soil health. That's kind of the simple terms. If your earthworms come back, you're doing something
And
right.
you know they're coming back when you got youngsters and teenagers and diaper-wearing toddlers, you know? But if it's all just grandpa and grandma, right, and you don't see any of the younger ones, what's happening to them? It's not because they're not putting on egg-laying rings. You see the rings on them, but where's the progeny? Where's the growth in the population?
Your field and drive by it after a spring rain. Road will get slick with
crawls
worms.
up
Yeah,
the
everybody
road.
left town because it's no place to breathe.
Well, and everybody that could got there because they left every place where beating the daylights out of the ground or no telling it. They don't like that environment either.
No, they can't stand standing water.
Yeah.
Right, exactly right. Yeah. I had a thought come, and it was something you and I were talking about over breakfast, Mark. What was it?
Who's going to pay the bill?
Oh, I know. It was, we were talking about soil organic matter readings, and we touched on it here briefly. But what we're talking about when we talk about maintaining the bubble, right, is that so often what we'll do is we'll burst the bubble. And today we're calling it a high-speed disc, even vertical tillage. And we take the root system and we take all of the biological activity that's been surrounding and saturating that root system, which now is going to turn on it, right, and digest it and turn it into meaningful humate material, right, to make additional colloidal surfaces to support more life, better known as soil organic matter readings, and we tear it all apart.
What changes organic matter readings quicker than anything?
Well, the University of New Hampshire did it, just feeding sugar to microbes in the presence of oxygen.
And why is that? It's because the microbes replicate over and over and over again. So
It's in the
what
deep.
we have been, what the general public has been educated to believe is organic matter, mostly is debris. It is a food source yet to be broke down for the microbes to expand.
Yeah.
It's the microbiology itself and the fungals that are creating the organic matter.
That's what the New Hampshire people pointed out.
If you talk to, excuse me, but I got good friends that went to school, where you went to school, that are our age, and he says,
Our age, you're a lot older than me.
okay, my age, he's older than I am. But what I'm getting at is these guys agronomy, he said, what makes you think you can change your organic matter that much in 5 or 10 years when it had hundreds of thousands of years to get to where it was? And I think we're being misinformed over what truly organic material is, and we live in timber soils. These soils were conducive to timber, not prairie grasses, okay? What I can tell you is if you want to increase your organic matter and your soil holding capacity and everything else, find a way to farm your microbes. And if you're a good steward, which is what a farmer is supposed to be, then you find a way to expand them on the least amount of cost for the most amount of benefit you can. And expand that world, the mycorrhiza and the microbiology in the soil. If you could expand it, you're way ahead of the curve. And we get soil samples back that say you need this much fertilizer and that much fertilizer, but if they're exposed to the right test, we got tens of thousands of pounds of it stored out there. So what good is 200, 300, 400 pounds going to do to that equation? And this buddy of mine I was telling you about will argue with you, well, if you take that long enough, you're going to deteriorate that. Even if I could do what I think I'm doing, he says you're going to lower that number. And I said, I think you'll come to find out we won't. The breakdown of the new material and the microbiology will fix it.
It's the same parent material that made it what it is today.
Actually, you've done a better job because the parent material that was here was timber forest ground. We actually can improve on that by expanding the beneficial microbiology. We actually are starting over. When we cleared these trees, it was almost like starting over because we took a hardwood environment and now we want to become a prairie soil. Well, that doesn't happen overnight. But if you want to move in that direction, one of the first things probably that should be done is better tiling systems to manage the water. The second thing is to change a philosophy and an approach. And it's not that you're farming corn and soybeans and wheat and pigs and cattle. It's we are farming the dirt. We are farming the dirt. Had a young man ask, or not a young man, I had a gentleman ask me last spring when I got done planting if I got done. And I said, yeah. He said, did you get a good stand? I told him I never figured out how to get a stand yet. I can prepare the soil, I can plant the seed, but I don't know how to make it grow. Good Lord's been doing that since the beginning of time, okay? And so I don't know how to do that job, but I know we've been in the way. And if we will remove the general consensus of more is better, we're liable to find out that more is anything but better.
Maybe better is better?
Yeah. I said when I started this, I even told you that I was committed to this for 5 years, and I'm 3.5 years into it or whatever. And I'm already seeing very positive benefits in reduction of production, and the cost of production has been reduced greatly. Cost of it goes into production, but I want you to understand I've used no fungicides. Fungicides and pesticides, I don't care what anybody wants to say, are poison. They are poison.
I totally agree with you, Greg. Let's pick on fungicides a little bit.
Okay.
And I want your comment on this too. Okay, I'm trying to build up this microbiome. I'm feeding it with Pacific Grow and all these other microbes, and I'm spoon feeding it as it's growing. Then I decide all my neighbors are put on fungicide. I've always put on fungicide. I'm going to start putting that on. What does that do to what we just started to grow?
As one of my good friends from Texas tells me, a fungicide is basically a sleeping pill. It puts the plant into suspended animation. And as a result, for the most part, that means you're prone to more problems.
My good friend Trent.
While you slept,
Right.
the thief came in your house.
My good friend Trent in Washington, he actually did sap before a fungicide. 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, you can actually see the plant shut down right after application. It starved the disease by starving the nutrients.
Sounds like chemotherapy, doesn't it?
Chemotherapy.
Yeah, so I want to ask a question. In my understanding of all this, when the plant shuts down, the symbiotic relationship between the mycorrhizae and the microbiology shuts down. Because the plant says, I don't need anything. So they're out of work. So they're not replicating, they're not expanding. Okay? What would be interesting to me is how far out did he take that? When did it start to revert back the other way? How many 3 days did he go out?
Oh, he went 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. So he probably had 4 tests.
Okay, so he had 9 days after application.
Had it ever started?
At 9 days, was it different than at 3?
Yes.
Okay, so it does start, but what I'm getting at is again, and I made this statement, and then I'm just pretty blunt. It's poison. It's there to kill something, okay? And that plant has to, and you just confirmed it, has to metabolize it in some fashion, okay? In that metabolization, how much are we affecting the grain that it's producing that's affecting the pig and the chicken and the cow that we're feeding, that we're eating?
Tremendous a lot.
I think more than we realize yet. I do believe technology is bringing us to a point that now we're really starting to get a picture of what we've been doing for 60 or 70 years. And you can choose to put blinders on. I made a statement 4 or 5 years ago, probably back about the time that you and I met, that I believe I had through another process that I was working on, I had come to the conclusion that we were treating the dirt as a drug addict, and the last best high a drug addict has, he has to take more and more and more to get the same effect, and the last best high he has is the one that kills him. So I had surmised, I'm not a theorist, I'm just to throw it out there and see if it sticks kind of guy. I'd kind of surmised in my own mind that you could go from raising a record bumper crop, I think this is how fragile it is, to next year not even being able to produce a weed. If you fracture that network to a point of non-recover, I believe the non-beneficials and stuff could take over. I'm not saying that to scare people, but that's what motivates me. When I start thinking I am supposed to be a steward of the land, which implies I have the land's best interest in heart, I am doing the best for it I can, all of a sudden I realize I'm treating the dirt as a drug addict, and I'm almost the drug dealer. That this makes you feel better, you do better, okay? I prefer a more homeopathic approach that you got a health problem, why don't you change your diet or change your lifestyle or something, see if it helps you, rather than here's a pill, take it and get better.
I've seen a situation where a guy, he was onions, having a lot of fungal problems with pink root, rot, couldn't kill it. Just 16 applications of fungicide.
That's all?
So he calls me after harvest, says, I got to do something different. I go to his field 6 months later and it's been bare, won't even grow a weed, like you're saying, Greg. You know, that soil is poisoned, and so is his onions. So
I think it all is.
So we as agriculture's got to step up. As individuals, that's how capitalism works. We need to start making our own decisions based on the love for community and our own health.
Well, I told actually I believe it was my pastor I told this one time. I said, if anything in agriculture scares me, it ought to make you really freak out. And he says, what do you mean? I said, because I'm driven by all sides. I live in a competitive world. I have to compete to survive. I said, so when I become nervous about what's going on in agriculture and what's going on in the dirt and what's going on in the food that we eat, if I'm worried about it, it ought to scare you to death.
You know, it's interesting because when I worked in Russia for 5 years. You go to a grocery store there and you see tubular crops like potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, beets, and they all have dirt on them.
Yep.
And when the people go in there and shop, they are grabbing that carrot, they're running it through their hands, they're looking at that dirt, some of them smelling it, and if it passes the smell test, then they'll buy it. They want that healthy, smelling, earthy smell.
And they're rubbing that dirt into
their hands.
And then they eat something and they put it in their mouth.
We have two large 125-gallon, 250,000-liter totes cut in half with beets and carrots, and one in each one buried in sand. And they're just like you just dug them out of the ground. We had some for Christmas dinner. They were absolutely delicious.
Oh, I'll ask you this question. Give me 4 things that we need to change.
Okay, we gotta have air and water.
Okay, number one,
exchange.
you gotta have soil.
Okay, if you don't start there, you're already behind the 8 ball. Okay, we have to have some faith in the fact that the good Lord provided everything we need to grow a crop. Okay, and that being said, follow your soil samples, but learn to read them. Don't let somebody else tell you how to read them. Learn to know what you're seeing. Okay? Third, the best way in the world to expand organic matter is to expand microbiology and mycorrhiza.
And the root mass.
And well, the root mass goes with it. So we have to expand that universe. We have to get it outside the bubble.
Grow the bubble.
And fourth, and I'm not going to say this is last on the list. Maybe it should be first on the list, but it's also last. Continue to learn what you see, not what you hear.
All right, now you ask him that question.
Yeah.
4 things, not in any specific order. Air is number 1. If we don't have air movement, we don't have any.
How do you get air movement? 6, 8, 10 inches in the ground. How do you get air movement?
Curse busters certainly plays a
but-
huge part of it.
But what causes it?
Fracturing
Water
of the soil.
movement through the fracturization of the soil.
And I think you ought to jump in there about telling about water going down and water coming up.
Absolutely. The hydrolyzation,
All right,
it works like a piston. It's pulling that oxygen deeper and deeper into the soil.
Right.
This is why.
You both can ask me the same question.
I'm trying to plug you here.
Yeah, and I'm trying to plug everybody a little bit.
I think you ought to be able to inoculate that soil and use Pacifico, because I think that's the microbial feed.
I agree with that. I just said the
Okay,
same
so the
thing.
microbes that's in,
Expand our universe.
all right.
Yep.
I think you ought to look at high populations of microbes with broad amount of species, diverse species.
Why are we putting more in the ground than's already there?
Yes, because we've killed a lot.
We're putting non naturally occurring microbes in there.
Who's to say that there's non-natural?
Okay, let me ask you this: was it there when God created the dirt?
Yes.
Okay, and you're saying we've killed them all.
No, I didn't say all.
Okay, so now listen, I don't disagree with you, but I don't want to give somebody false data or information. What I'm going to tell you is, without doing that, if you take care of the water and the oxygen, and we use your product to expand these beneficial microbes, we're going to accelerate the curve. We're not going to change the end result. We're going to accelerate the curve. Because if we do everything right, God created the dirt great. It's so great that if we would fall off the face of the earth in maybe as little as 50 years, it'd fix itself. Okay? So what I'm saying is, I'm not disagreeing with you. This is you and me having this conversation, okay? I believe everything's in every soil that is supposed to be there to do what it has to do. Maybe in spore state, maybe asleep, okay? But it will awake as the environment asks it to awake. A bird will fly over and poop it out from somewhere else. I don't know.
But my response to that is, how do you get over these odd diseases that I'm seeing, like anthracnose and charcoal rot in soil? How do you do that?
Make the soil healthy. It's no different than Crohn's disease or irritable bowel system in people, and it's expanding, just like the diseases you're talking about are expanding.
But they've got bronchitis and they still want to smoke, so you
Yeah, I
got to
know.
bring something else in there.
Absolutely.
That's why we're overshooting the
We're
target.
on the same page, man.
I agree,
Yep.
but we're overshooting the target to be more of a diverse community.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important.
I think I could maybe close this up with a sad story.
Oh, don't do that.
Well, I hate to do that,
Gotta
but
leave 'em on a
I
positive
think
note.
it's on the point of what you're debating right here. This farm in northern New York, which is all over my website, with what they did, with no carbon sources added, no
It's your launching
microbiology,
pad.
you know, all they did was change their tillage in 1984, and they've never deviated. But I was there this October, and I took a sample and sent it to biome makers. After I'd taken the sample, I found out that it was a really backward spring this year in northern New York. And they actually went to the neighbor and borrowed a disc in order to get the weeds under control before they could seed their alfalfa and mixed forages. The number of species reported was less than 600. I can almost guarantee you that it was over 2,000 before they ran that disc.
What's mine? What's mine?
I'd have to look at your report to tell you, but I know it's over 1,000.
I'm just curious.
I'm thinking it was 12 to 1,500.
And what I'm telling you is to me, this is like having a pristine forest, and as soon as you run a tillage, 99.9%, 99.99% of tillage tools through the dirt, you flash fired that forest. You started over. It doesn't mean it won't regenerate in 200 years or 300 years. But it's going to take a period of time to regenerate.
The Mason farm had done that.
Yep.
And all we did was change the way in which the soil accessed oxygen or gas exchange and managed water with no tile and a soil type that cannot be tiled.
Right. I've got kids and grandkids coming under me. I got grandsons in their 20s already. And we're sitting here, and I told them that we have farms that there won't be a tool on it other than a curse buster and planting and harvesting tool for 5 years. But we have one particular farm that's really tight. And back when I first talked to him, he told me something that he probably wished he wouldn't have told me now. But the older of the two sons that work with me all the time still believes in what I taught him a long time ago, and that was, I bought a Blue Jet inline ripper years ago, and the only reason I bought a Blue Jet inline ripper was it was an inline ripper and it fractured the ground and it took it like a deck of cards and went, it didn't turn the ground. When I first talked to him, he told me, he said, if you really got compaction, he said, maybe the best thing you can do is run a good inline ripper 14 or 15, 16 inches deep, but you need to be at least 14 inches in the ground to get the fracture between the shanks. I said, what's a good one? He said, Blue Jet makes a good one. I said, well, that's funny, I got one. So this fall we're sitting here and we're going back to corn on that farm and one thing and another. So that inline ripper ended up hooked to the back of that, and we inline ripped about 130 acres, 15 inches deep. My intention is next spring to hit it one time with a curse buster and plant it. So I don't think, we haven't seen it yet, and he hadn't put his 2 cents in. I don't think we screwed it up. I think I helped it. As long as I don't pull any tool through that ground that either turns the soil. When I'm talking about turning the soil, I'm talking more than 1.5 inches deep. That doesn't turn the soil. I love the fact that everybody around here in the 80s got rid of discs. Everybody around here had a disc or 2 or 3, okay? And they pulled them everywhere. And it'd take out weeds, it'd break up clods. It was a fix-all tool. Field cultivators came out, and guys started running them, but boy, weeds wouldn't go through them like they go through a disc. But eventually we figured out it's better to have a field cultivator than a disc because that disc is such a compaction tool, all right? This is how gullible the farming the farming community is and how vicious the corporate world is. They invented something called a high-speed disc. I couldn't believe they even used that name, okay? I have several buddies that swear this is the greatest tool ever invented. And I looked at them and I said, boys, it's a disc. You can just pull it 12 mile an hour instead of 5.
All right. All right, sorry.
Yep. Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Well, you guys hit my hot buttons with your list of 4. Yeah, if we don't build the house bigger, then it's going to probably get smaller. So that means we have to eliminate mechanical
I want to
barriers
rephrase that.
to, you know,
We have a mansion the size that you can't hardly imagine. Why do we want to live in one little bathroom?
well, that's exactly right.
It's there. Why not utilize
We
it?
need to live in the entire house.
That's right.
And our effort would be to actually, as good stewards, to add space. And we don't need to tear down the house or the mansion or whatever we think we have in order to add rooms.
It's to prepare the next room. The room, they're there. We just need to open the
best
door.
thing that we can do in preparation for next year's crop is the root system development and the decomposition process which took place on the previous, as a result of the previous crop.
If I take a root system that's that deep this year, and I do everything we just talked about, next year I got a root system this deep. Okay, at the end of the first year, where's all my microbiology and my mycorrhiza?
Up there.
Absolutely.
Where your first one was.
Okay, so the only way I get these to go down here is to move oxygen and water, and the food's already there.
And physical barriers.
The food's already there. You have to, it's like unlocking the door in the mansion. We can't move that next room till we make the key.
Right.
Okay, so you're adding on a room is kind of the version of me. We got this whole mansion. We just have to get the right key. You got to check every key in every door. You get the next room.
Yeah. Yeah. One key doesn't fit every door.
No, it takes a different key for every door.
That's the end of the silver bullet.
Yep.
Right? That's
Yep.
the end of the silver bullet.
Yep.
So I guess with that, you know, with our list,
Now I got to think
can-
what I told him.
we can wrap this up, right? And thank you guys for participating in this epilogue. I think it's been educational for me to continue to review these things. That's the way it is, right? The Lord says, open your mouth, I'll fill it. That means that if we're available to expose our ignorance and our desire to know more, God says, just ask me. I'll give you wisdom.
I agree with that.
So thank you very much, guys.